Hi guys, and welcome to this week's edition of Learning Life Sciences. Today we're going to look at grade 12 theories of evolution. There's a few things that we need to check before we start, and these are from the SAGS document, and it spells out exactly what you need to know. So let's have a look at the checklist before we continue. Right, so these are the things that you must know when preparing on the theories of evolution. You should be able to distinguish between a hypothesis and the theory. We should explain and compare the theories about the origins proposed by Darwin, Lamarck, as well as Alfred Wallace. You should be able to describe and explain natural selection and compare it to artificial selection. It's also very important to describe and explain the formation of new species and speciation. It's also very important for you to state the evidence that supports the theories of evolution. And most importantly, you should be able to give examples of evolution in present times. And this will refer to the questions that are raised about drug resistance and evolution that happens today. And there's many examples that we can look at. So before we get into the questions for this afternoon, let's look at where we've got our questions from. Okay, so let's look at a question from November 2011, and it's on multiple choice, guys. It's very important to remember that evolution is not exclusively a data response question. You could get questions from multiple choice. You could get questions that are an essay. So you must be prepared, and you should apply those terminologies, especially in your multiple choice. So what we're going to look at today is the first question is the multiple choice questions. Let's read the question carefully and see what the instructions are. Various options are provided as possible answers to the following questions. Choose the correct answer. And we've got to choose the correct answer. It's very important for you to number the questions exactly correctly as they appear in the question paper. And in this case, all that is required from you is to write the alphabet of the correct answer. Let's look at question number 1.1. A scientific idea that still has to be tested is referred to as A, a theory, B, a hypothesis, C, a fact, and D, a belief. Now, if we were to look at this question and we were to look at the options that are given, the question again says, a scientific idea that still has to be tested. Something that still has to be tested is obviously not a fact. And that is something that we can easily look at and eliminate. So if you're not too sure about what the answer is, there are obvious answers that we do not look at. And a fact is something that is scientifically proven, and hence we will not look at a fact. The next answer that is possibly not correct here is a belief. And beliefs are what is influenced by people's attitudes and values about things. And I suppose that a theory in evolution is not a belief. It is something that has been researched and an idea proposed and put forward. The most correct answers for this would be either A or B. And if we looked at what a hypothesis is an intelligent guess. It's something that a scientist will put forward, they make a prediction about what possibly the outcome of an experiment would be. And a theory would be an observation that is done, and a scientist would prepare a theory based on a series of observations that is done. And this is exactly what Darwin did, and he proposed a theory of natural selection based on the observations of various organisms that he had found. So the most correct answer for this would be A, the theory. Okay, it's very important for you to remember that theories are not scientific facts, and they're based on observations, and hence the theory of natural selection is based exclusively on observations made by Darwin and a theory presented, which is now argued, and people tend to agree with the theories or disagree. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 1.2. Select my pen. Which one of the following can be used as evidence to support common ancestry? If we remember, common ancestry simply means individuals having evolved from a common ancestor. And lots of the evidence for evolution is based on evidence from common ancestry. Let's look at the options that have been given for this question. So the first option is different DNA sequencing in different species. Okay. Option B would be geographic distribution of different phyla. and this has got to do with biogeographic distribution of organisms. C would be homologous structures of a whale's flipper and a bird's wing. And if you remember, homologous structures are structures that have a similar structure, but they have a different function. And this would refer to the limb of a bat, the wing of a bat, the wing of a bat, the wing of birds, the limbs of humans, of a horse, of the flipper of a whale. These are structures that essentially are structurally similar, but they have different functions. And this is more or less the correct answer for this. But we still got to look at the fourth answer, possible answer for this, and that is analogous structures. And if you remember analogous structures, these are structures which have different structures but similar functions. So a bird's wing and an insect's wing both have similar functions, but they are structurally very, very different. And hence, when we look at this question again, the question says, which one of the following can be used as evidence to support common ancestry? And I would choose the homologous structures, as homologous structures are used as evidence to support evolution. Okay, hope you guys got that. Let's move on to the next question. The next question, 1.3. The following statements relate to fossils. Let's read these statements. Statement number 1. Very few organisms end up as fossils. Some organisms tend to decay before becoming fossils. Only soft parts of organisms preserve easily. And the fourth statement is, geological processes may destroy fossils. Let's underline the key words. The question is, which of the following statements above are possible reasons why there are gaps in the fossil record? Let's look at these statements very quickly and let's analyze and see why some of them are correct and why some are incorrect, and why there are many gaps in the fossils that are available to us. Very few organisms end up as fossils, and that's correct because most of the times conditions are unfavorable for fossilization, and the organisms that die and decay do not fossilize. The second option, some organisms tend to decay before becoming fossils, and that's very true. Fossilization is a long-term process, and organisms tend to decay very fast. And this is exactly why there is not enough of evidence in terms of fossils available. The third option is only soft parts of organisms preserve easily. The problem with soft parts is that they tend to decay and decompose very quickly, and hence the soft parts of organisms do not fossilize very easily, and hence this would be an incorrect statement. If we looked at the fourth statement, geological processes may destroy fossils, and that is very true. A process like a volcano would end up destroying massive amounts of fossils. You find floods will tend to wash away fossils, and these would not be easily available. So if we were to answer this question here, I would select options 1, 2, and 4, and let's look at which would be the correct answer available. So 1, 2, and 4 only, and the correct answer for this would be D. Let's go on to the next question. Question 1.4. Which one of the statements below relates to biological evolution? A. Artificial selection is essential for evolution of species. Humans, B would be humans, are now progressed from a technological age into an information age, and that we call information evolution or technological evolution. And C, modern species evolve from ancestral species. And D, genetic mutations generally cause species to die. The question again, let's read that again very carefully. Which one of the statements below relate to biological evolution? It's going to erase this out here very quickly. And let's look at this. The most correct answer for this is C, and let me explain to you why. If we look at A, artificial selection is essential for evolution of species. This is not a natural process and hence does not support biological evidence. Humans now progressed from technological age into an information age, guys, and this we call the evolution of technology, and this is not biological evidence and hence evolution, and hence we eliminate that. If we look at D, genetic mutations generally cause species to die, and this is not entirely true because mutations can often result in organisms benefiting from them and ensuring that they survive. And I would think this is a generalization which is not correct. The most correct answer for this would be C, and I would agree with the statement where modern species evolve from an ancestral species, and hence the most correct answer is C. Let's go on to the next question. Right, Homo habilis. Homo habilis, guys, if you remember, Homo habilis was the handyman. And sometimes, even before you get to answering the questions, you need to ask yourself, and those questions that you ask yourself often end up giving you clues to answering your questions. Okay, so Homo habilis, and if you remember, Homo habilis was the handyman. Let's look at the options that are given to us. Was A, called handyman because he was a tool maker? B, had a larger brain capacity than Homo erectus? C, was the first Homo sapiens without a prominent brow ridge? And D, was the first Homo species to leave Africa? Yes, guys, remember I spoke about Homo habilis being the handyman? And yes, he's going to be the individual that was able to make tools, and these individuals were capable of using their hands and manipulating tools so that they could survive successfully. So they hunted with tools, they were able to survive, and Homo habilis were the first individuals that were able to use tools to survive for hunting as well as for their livelihoods. The answer there would be A. Let's go on to the next question. 1.6. The table below shows the percentage similarities of DNA of different primates compared to humans. In this column we've got organisms which are all primates, and we've got humans, and in this column we've got the percentage of DNA similarity between humans and other primates. If we look at the first, we're using humans as a reference, and hence their percentage is 100%. When we look at the second organism, the capuchin monkeys, they have an 84.2% similarities with humans. The vervet monkeys having a 90.5% similarity to humans. The rhesus monkeys having a 91.1% similarity to humans. The gibbons a 94.7% similarity to humans, and the chimpanzees having the most similarity, having 97.6% similarity in their DNA. Let's look at this question very carefully. Which of the following pairs of primates are most closely related to humans? So when we look at the table, we can identify the following two pairs as being closely related. Let's look at this. This is 97.6, and that's probably the highest. And then below that would be 94.7, and we could look at the corresponding organisms that give us those two percentages. So it's the gibbon and the chimpanzees. The most correct answer for that would be A, and that would be the correct answer. It's very important, guys, to look at the other options as well, to just make sure that there's something that you've looked at all these answers and that you have not overlooked a possible answer. Gibbon and rhesus monkeys, obviously not. If you look, their percentages are very low compared to the gibbons and the chimpanzees. Rhesus monkey and the vervet monkeys are related, but the percentages are relatively less. And the last one as well, the percentages are far less than the initial two pairs of the gibbons and the chimpanzees. So we're done with the multiple choice questions, and now we're going to move on to question 2. Before we start with question 2, guys, let's have a short break, and we'll get back and we'll look at some data response questions on evolution. So let's see you after a short break. Welcome back, guys. During this session, we're going to look at 2 more questions, and these questions focus specifically on speciation. And if you guys remember, Darwin spent a lot of time voyaging around and collecting information, and when he did get to the South American islands, he went to the Galapagos Islands. And here, he had found lots of evidence to support his theories of evolution. Let's look at the next question. It's a data response question, so we're going to read through the question, and we're going to highlight key words, and then we're going to attempt to answer those questions. So let's read through. Question number 2. Darwin discovered two different varieties of tortoises on two different islands on the Galapagos Islands. One had a domed shell and the other a short neck, and the other had a longer neck. The two islands had very different vegetation. On one of the islands, Island X, was a rather barren, dry and arid area. It had no grass and rather short tree like cactus plants. On the other island, Island Y, there were no cactus plants, but it had a good supply of water and grass grew freely across the island. The diagrams below show the two main varieties of tortoises on the Galapagos Islands. The two main varieties of tortoises on the Galapagos Islands are shown below: tortoise A and tortoise B. Let's look at the first question. 2.1. Which tortoise, A or B, would have been found on Island X? It's very important to let's look at the vegetation that was available on Island X. Island X was rather barren, it was dry and arid, and it had no grass, but rather short, tree-like cactus plants. Okay, so if we go back to the question, if we look at the two tortoises on this diagram here, the difference between these two would be the length, change my pen, the length of their neck. This has a long neck and this tortoise has a short neck, differently colored, obviously adapted and camouflaged to the type of vegetation and grass in which they lived. When we look at Island X was an island that had lots of grass, and hence the organism that was best did not have, when we look at Island X, guys, if we go back, Island X had no grass, but it had tree-like cactus plants, and hence an organism that needed to feed on grass would be tortoise B, and hence it stretched out its neck in order to reach to the cactus on the top. So the answer for the tortoise that would be found on Island X would be tortoise B. Go on to the next question. Which tortoise, A or B, would have been found on Island Y? And let's go back to Island Y and let's look at the climate on Island Y. On the other island, there were no cactus plants, but it had a good supply of water and grass grew freely across the island. When we look at these two, and we said that tortoise B was adapted to living on Island X, tortoise A was adapted to living on Island Y. And the reason why it could survive there was that it did not need to stretch out to reach the leaves of the cactus plants that were growing much taller. It lived on the grass and it didn't need to actually stretch and grow its neck, and hence it survived, and those that had shorter necks survived and lived comfortably with the availability of grass on that land. Let's look at the next question, and that's explain your answer to question 2.1b, and that's exactly what I just did now, but I'm going to write that out for you. So on Island Y, there was lots of grass, and there was water available, and hence on this grass the tortoise A did not need to adapt to feeding of taller plants. And that would give you 2 marks as you've answered and explained that it had adapted to living on grass, and the grass was found lower down as compared to the cactus plants, and hence it did not need to adapt to survive on cactus. Let's move on to the next question, question 3. This question has been adapted from February-March 2010 paper 2. Let's read the question very quickly. Study the following diagrams which show different stages 1 to 4 of a process in evolution. When we look at this diagram, here we see mainland, and on it is a species called species A. Eventually, over a period of time, we see that the mainland starts to separate out, and we have species A being moved a bit onto that little section of land. Over a further period of time, if we go on to that, we see due to continental drifting, species A has separated out from species B, which is now on an island, which is separated out by a water barrier. And this is how organisms eventually have been separated over a period of time. Over a period of time, that space grew between them, and this island eventually was separated from the mainland, and on island B we found that species B developed and adapted to living in those conditions. These conditions were very much different to the conditions in the mainland, and we can clearly see that species B had evolved to those conditions. Let's read further and see what the questions are on. Question number 3.1. Name the evolutionary process that resulted from the continental drift shown. Okay. Now, when we look at this diagram, we can clearly see here, at the end of this process, we've got species A and species B. And that process of where a species develops from another is called speciation. And speciation is essentially the formation of a new species. So the answer to that question would be speciation. Let's move on to question 3.2. Describe how the original population of species A split to become two species as indicated in the diagrams above. So we need to describe exactly how species A became two species as indicated in the diagram. Okay, so let's look at this. Is a 5-mark question, and it's very important for us to have at least 5 points to answer this question correctly and to achieve those 5 marks. So the first thing that we must say is that species A first split up because of continental drifting. So species A split up into two little populations. The second point is that when we look at this diagram, we can clearly see that because the islands moved apart, the species became geographically separated. So erase that. They became geographically separated. And we call this, if you guys remember, and this is called allopatric speciation. We then say that each group on the different islands undergoes micro evolution. Next point we can talk about is that over a period of time, these organisms adapt to the climate on these islands. And when they come together, they will not interbreed. This results in the formation of two different species. So we see in this question a population being separated out because of continental drifting, a piece of land separated out from the mainland, and over a period of time that gap grew, and that population A was separated out by a geographical barrier, which was water in this case, and prevented the organisms from interacting. These organisms adapted over a period of time to the conditions, and we see that they've now formed a new species. When a new species forms, the best way to test if they can interbreed and form new species would be to interbreed them. And we see that in this case, these organisms over a period of time cannot interbreed and hence have formed two new species, and we call that species A and species B. We're going to go into a break, guys, and when we get back, we're going to do some more questions on evolution. Welcome back, guys. Let's look at the next question, and this question is on mutation. Let's read question 4. The following questions are based on mutation. This question often comes in terminology, it will often come in definitions as well. Define a gene mutation. You got to remember that we have two types of mutations. We have a chromosomal mutation and a gene mutation. In this case, the question wants you to define what a gene mutation would be, and this would refer to mutations that happen on a gene or that happen on a chromosomal at a gene level, which affect the DNA sequence. So a mutation would be a change in the sequence of the DNA. And that simply would mean that you'd get a mark for saying a change, and secondly, in the sequence of DNA would be the second mark. Often we get the terms a mistake. You could also use a change, you could use mistake, or you can use the word alteration. And this would also essentially give you the mark. Let's move on to the next question. Name two factors that can cause mutations. Factors that cause mutations are called mutagens. So this question could also be asked, what is the term used to describe a factor that causes mutations, and that would be a mutagen. So mutagens cause mutations. But this question needs us to give two factors that cause mutations, and for this we could say there's several factors that cause mutations, and one of them is, firstly, they could be caused by ultraviolet radiation. They could also be caused by some chemicals, as well as there's certain viruses that can also cause mutations. So I'm giving you a few extra options, but remember that the examiner will mark the first two, and hence do not waste time writing several when the first two. And be careful when you're answering this, give the best two that you think are possibly the most correct. Let's move on to the next question, question 4.3. Differentiate between a neutral mutation and a lethal mutation. And the term differentiate means simply what is the difference between the two. For each one, you've got to explain each one in detail to explain the difference. What is a neutral mutation? So a mutation obviously is a change. A neutral mutation would be a mutation that has no benefit or harm to an organism. So we find that often mutations take place that do not affect an organism. It does not affect an organism's physiology, does not affect its appearance, and hence we say that it is a neutral mutation with no significant benefit or harm to the organism. As opposed to that, a lethal mutation would be a mutation, and the word lethal simply means deadly, fatal, and these cause injury, cause harm to the organisms, and hence we can clearly say that these mutations are harmful. They often lead to death if inherited. Okay, so these mutations would be mutations that harm an organism and affect them from their normal functioning. So this would be something that is fatal, and this would be something that does not necessarily affect an organism. Okay, let's look at the next question. 5.1. The peppered moth, Biston betularia, has two phenotypes for body color: dark, which is blackish, and pale, which is whitish. The trunks of the trees on which the moths rest are black in polluted environments compared to the white trunks of trees in unpolluted environments. In both unpolluted and polluted environments, birds are the predators of these moths. An investigation was carried out to determine the number of dark and pale peppered moths present in polluted and unpolluted environments using a sampling technique. The results of this investigation are shown in the table below. Let's look at this table. So it gives us the type of environment, showing us a polluted environment and an unpolluted environment. And we have two types of moths from the data. You can see it's given to us that there were two types of moths, a dark moth and a pale moth. A sampling technique was used to determine the numbers of these dark and pale moths, and here we see that in the polluted environment there were 150 dark moths that were counted as compared to 40 pale moths. In the unpolluted environment there were only 30 dark moths found on the trees as compared to 170 pale moths found. And you've got to remember that these moths have a natural predator, which are birds, and based on their color, the birds would favor them. Now, to make you to help us understand this situation, during the British the industrial age in Britain, you found that there was lots of pollution given off from the trees, and these trees, the pollution and the soot would settle on the trees. And as they settle on the trees, the moths that naturally lived there would need to were camouflaged. The ones that were dark would camouflage against the black backgrounds of the trees, and the white ones were more easily visible because the trees became darker in color, and it was easier for the birds to pick up the white moths. And hence, the numbers between the polluted and the unpolluted environments would be significantly different when we compare these two environments. So let's look at the first question. 5.1.1. Formulate a hypothesis for the above investigation. Guys, it's very important to remember that a hypothesis is a statement, and we've got to make a statement based on the information that is presented to us in this table. There's two possible hypotheses that we could make for this. The first one, if we looked at the number of dark moths in the polluted environment, we see that they are significantly larger than the number of pale moths in the polluted environment. So we could say, I would write down as my first option would be the number of dark moths, the number of dark moths are more than the pale moths in a polluted environment. And we can clearly see that from the table where we've got far more dark moths than pale moths. We could also write, if we look back at the table, we can clearly see here that when we look at the unpolluted environment, we can see that there were many more pale moths than there are dark moths. So we can infer, or we could stipulate, we could make a hypothesis that goes as the following. So in an unpolluted environment, let's look at that, pale moths are more than dark colored moths. Guys, we've got to remember that when we write a hypothesis, it is a statement. For a 3-mark question like this, you've got to write a statement down. You do not write the aim, or I think, or I predict. Simply make a statement about what the information that has been presented to you. And for that, you get 2 marks for the quality of your wording and an additional mark for this making a statement. Let's look at the next question. Suggest 3 factors that might have decreased the validity of this investigation. Now we've got to remember that sampling techniques are subjected to the way the sampling method has been carried out and the environment. If we look at this question, we see that there were 2 types of environments that we used, a polluted environment and an unpolluted environment. We have no indication of the nature of the size of the area or other factors, and hence I would first guess that the environment was not controlled, and we don't have any clear indication of the size of the environment. So what affects the validity of this is that the size of the environments may not be the same. And that simply means that if we looked at a larger environment and a smaller environment, we'd obviously proportionately get the differences, and hence it needs to be very important that the environments that they chose were of similar area, similar size. The next factor that could affect the validity of this would be that we could look at both environments were very different in terms of vegetation. So it's possible that the vegetation was different. The other factor would be that the climate in the 2 environments could be different also, and hence there hasn't been enough of information provided to us regarding this, and hence we could infer that the climate was not the same. For a question like this, guys, we've got to look at the best 3 answers that you need to give, and hence the examiners, as I said, and I constantly repeat this, and they will look at the best 3 that you give. If you're in doubt, write the best 3, and if you're not too sure, maybe add another point. But the examiner will mark the first 3, as it's clearly stipulated that they need the 3 factors that have decreased the validity. Let's move on to the next question. Using the table and your understanding of natural selection, explain the results of the polluted environment. And that question is for 4 marks. When we looked at this table, we looked at the unpolluted and we looked at the polluted. This question specifically refers to the polluted environment. So we've got to comment on how natural selection favors the larger number of dark moths as compared to pale moths. So how would we answer this question? Okay, so let's look at this. So in a polluted environment, the pale moths are more easily visible by the birds, and the birds are the predators. This means that more pale moths are eaten, and we can infer that the darker moths are more camouflaged and thus less visible. We can say next that the darker moths are better adapted to surviving in the polluted environment. Go back to the question. And this is essentially how you would get your 4 marks. You've got to be clear enough and explain the effect of pollution and that organisms better adapted to an environment will survive. And here is a classical example where the moths that were darker colored were more camouflaged and hence the birds could not easily find them, but the white moths or the brightly colored moths against the black background were more easily picked up by the birds and hence they were less adapted to the environment. And here we see how nature selects individuals that are better adapted to the environment to survive. Let's go on to the next question. The next question, describe how sympatric speciation occurs. And this is a 6-mark question. Before we attempt to answer this question, we've got to remember that there are 2 types of speciation, allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. To recall allopatric speciation, we saw that when a geographical barrier or a physical barrier separates a population into 2 subpopulations, that process of speciation is called allopatric speciation because there is a physical or geographical barrier that separates out the 2 groups of individuals, resulting in the formation of 2 new species. Sympatric speciation in this case would be where within a population some individuals are separated from the rest because of several reasons. They could be reproductively separated, they could be due to morphological adaptation separated from the rest, and hence we see that this type of speciation is the development or the formation of a species within a population where they become reproductively separated from the rest. And that's the key word, that these organisms are separated from the rest of the population reproductively to a point that in the future they do not interbreed with them and thus they result in the formation of a new species. So let's answer this question. The question again says, describe how sympatric speciation occurs. Let's very quickly put on the key points to this. So we've got to first define what sympatric speciation is. So define what sympatric speciation is. very quickly. And remember that this is a 6-mark question, so we've got to at least put in the definition of sympatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is simply the formation of a new species as a result of reproductive isolation. This simply means that there is no geographical barrier that separates the new species. Okay. Let's put on a few more points for this. We see that each group undergoes changes and adapt to the environment independently. The differences that develop over a period of time prevents the two groups from interbreeding. And this essentially would answer the question. So again, we've got to remember that during sympatric speciation, within a population, organisms are separated from the rest because of reproductive isolation, and over a period of time these organisms become reproductively isolated within the same environment, not reproducing with the existing population that they evolved from. And we call this sympatric speciation, and it's very important. Some classical examples of sympatric speciation would be the cichlid fish in Lake Malawi, where we see more than 40 different species of cichlid fish living in there. This is a result of the females choosing to mate with the more favorably colored males, and we see there's a gene that increases, that often undergoes mutation, and this mutation results in the male fish being more brightly colored. The females are more attracted towards the brightly colored males, and hence these, on a constant basis over a period of time, have resulted in the formation of several different species of the cichlid fish in Lake Malawi. So here we see within that lake several different species of Malawi fish that have evolved over a period of time. Let's look at the next question. Question 6. Study the diagram below and answer the questions that follow. Let's look at this diagram, and we can clearly see here we've got two different types of snails, a dark colored snail, and we've got a snail that has got a whiter outer shell. Here we can clearly see a few of them being eliminated from the population, and then over a period of time we see predominantly the snails with a whiter color shell that survive. Let's look at the first question. Explain the phenomena illustrated in the diagram below, in the diagram above. If we were to look at this phenomena, and this phenomena is natural selection, and let's explain this very quickly. And remember guys, you've got to keep your answers short and simple so that you do not waste time writing too much. Natural selection. Okay, if we were to define this process, it is a process where those organisms with the most beneficial traits are likely to survive. Okay, and that's important. Darwin said that organisms that are best adapted to their environment survive and pass on their characteristics. You can clearly see that from the diagram, that these organisms were probably better adapted, and over a period of time they survived, and the ones that were least adapted were eliminated from the population. Let's go on to the last question. Describe the observation on which Darwin based his theory of evolution. And this is a 6-mark question, so it would mean that you've got to write at least six points for this. So let's write on the first point. Darwin said that organisms produce more offspring than can survive, and you clearly see that from the picture. Than can survive. These organisms compete for resources. You often see that in a population of offspring there are variations. So the next point is there is variation in the offspring. The offspring that have favorable traits survive The next point would be the favorable traits. The favorable traits are passed on to the next generation. And thus, we see that during natural selection, organisms better adapt to the environment, survive, and these characteristics are passed on to the next generation. And essentially, Darwin had based his observations on looking at various organisms and seeing the number of offspring that were produced and the number that survive. And often there was a good link between the ones that were better adapted to the environment than those that were not. We've come to the end of this lesson of theories in evolution, guys. Remember, it's very important to learn the terminology, remember the theories, and adapt your knowledge to the questions that have been that you would find. From my side, enjoy, happy learning, work smart, and enjoy.